Well, the last of our three installments for Reconstruction, the politics part of ESP. ESP is going to be our economic, social, and political. Remember, when we talk about these things, they're overlaying each other. It's not as if the economics happens for 10 years and then the social stuff happens for 5 years and then the politics happens for 1 year. They're all kind of happening in conjunction. The reason we've got it set up is most things in America are going to kind of fall into place based on economic changes. If you remember, we came for economic freedom, Jamestown, 1607. And then social issues are going to come, the Puritans and the Pilgrims coming for things like religious freedom. And then eventually we're going to have politics coming into the mix when people are feeling something very strongly. So this is, again, our last little bit of watching this through this time period. Reconstruction, when it comes to politics, is broken down into a couple different parts. And again, 1863 all the way to 1877. And the idea of being pretty much, how do you bring the southern states back in again? And 1863 to 65 is going to be Lincoln's presidential reconstruction. It becomes a political power struggle between the president, who thinks he, Abraham Lincoln, has power to do all the bringing back of the states, and the Congress that really doesn't want to bring them back in quite the same way he does. So they're going to have wrestling matches over like the Wade-Davis bill and such. Then once Lincoln is assassinated in 1865, on that April 14th, dying the next day, tax day, the way to remember it, the saddest day in American history. It's the day that Abraham Lincoln, our beloved president, died, and we have to pay taxes and tribute to the loss of our president. It's a way to remember it. Then Johnson's going to bring in the southern states quickly, and he's going to do it for a little bit different reason, but a similar situation, but it's going to be for politics also. And then finally, after the 1866 midterm election, that then the new Congress, with its two-thirds ability to override presidential vetoes, happens in 1867. From there, they're going to start doing what is known as radical Reconstruction. And then it's going to then move into a time period where, now that they've got Grant as president in 1868, he then swears his oath of office, his allegiance to the Constitution, everything else, on that March 4th, always March 4th until 1937. He is then going to take over, and he'll have a Republican president with a Republican Congress, Republican House, and a Republican South for a very long time, until slowly but surely those white liners, the redemptioners, take over and bring back a conservative kind of South with Democratic twist. And then after the crash of 1873, what really happens in general is that many of the northern whites begin to get a little frustrated with how much money it's costing to bring a solid South back into the Union under a kind of Republican slash non-Jim Crow mindset. And so by the time we get to 1877, we have our then election of Rutherford B. Hayes, which we'll talk about at the end of today. And that ends up basically ending Reconstruction as part of the deal that brings in his presidency. Anyways, so we have our five main steps. Lincoln's Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, Johnson's presidential Reconstruction, one Republican, one Democrat, then radical Reconstruction, fighting Johnson all the way till he's impeached, and he's not kicked out of office, but he basically is kind of dead in the water after that. And then eventually they're going to have a radical rule where they're going to kick the southern states all back out again, and they're going to make them accept the 14th and 15th Amendments. And finally, a last phase, which is basically Ulysses S. Grant trying to become the president that everyone needs, until the crash happens and then some other things happen. All right. Okay, focus. Yes. We start in 1860 for a particular reason. In that particular year, Abraham Lincoln, dancing there with a black woman, because he was known as a black Republican in this time period of race, he, in essence, is going to win by basically the southern wing of the Democratic Party and the northern wing of the Democratic Party more or less fading in this process. Now, if you look at our long story of history, we're not going to go over all this right now. We've had a wrestling match for a while, quite a long time. In a simple rule of majority system we've got, everything's going to fall into place pretty quickly. So we have the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. And then after Jefferson's win in 1800, the Democratic Republicans are going to have predominance. Then the southern kind of wing of the thing is going to start to dominate. Then we have our War of 1812, and the Federalists are going to have their little bit of a Hartford Convention, a little mini chance to kind of say, oh, King George, we'd like to be back with you because we don't like this war. We don't like the blockade you guys are doing on us. So that's going to bring about the end of the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party is going to die off, and then basically the Democratic Republicans will now just be called Republicans, but they're not the Republican Republicans. They're just that era's Republicans. And eventually, over time, they're going to kind of get morphed with the Federalists, because the Federalists don't really die. It's not as if they're lined up against a wall and shot. They just kind of, hey, and they join the Democratic Republicans. So the Republican Party Democratic Republicans, Jeffersons, start to morph into the National Republicans, and they start to end up being kind of more Hamilton Federalist kind of mindset. And then eventually, in the corrupt bargain of 1824, John Quincy Adams will win by basically having Henry Clay help him out in the House of Representatives, and that'll bring about the new Democratic Party in 1825. Sorry, coronavirus, got to keep it out. And then eventually the Whig Party is going to be designed to be kind of an anti-Jefferson, anti-Jackson type party designed by Henry Clay. I'll put myself up here in the National Republicans for a second. And then eventually we're going to then have a whole bunch of changes happening in this time period. And the Democratic Party will start to become kind of the party of the North, party of the kind of the South and the West. And then the Whig Party will be more than North, Southwest, but they're both national parties. For a very long time, from the 1830s on through the 1854 time period, we're actually have two nationalist parties. And then when the Democratic Party under Stephen Douglas, the little giant, pushes through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which kills off the Missouri Compromise, the one thing that was holding the country together for the longest time, now what we end up having is a very sectional system. The Republican Party then will be almost utterly northern and a little bit western, the free soil people that want more or less no slavery. The Democratic Party is going to be the national party, and still the fire eaters going to take it over. And so by 1860, the Democratic Party commits political suicide by separating themselves into the northern version under the Stephen Douglas little giant, Breckinridge, the vice president, who now runs for president in 1860 with the backing of outgoing president James Buchanan, and eventually John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, which is more or less kind of the Western slash, let's just not talk about this thing anymore. So eventually what you end up having is a break. Now, it's important to remember, though, from a Republican perspective, the way they think about this, my gray hair really picks up in the light. The way they think about it is the Republican Party is not really the national party. They're not the majority party. The only real long-term reason that Lincoln was able to win is that there was such a competition between the Democratic Party and the way that it kind of broke out. So we end up having, in the election of 1860 then, if you look at it from a county by county level, which is the way precincts are reported to the United States government, you have kind of this weird path across that old kind of Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening time period with the burned over district, where all the abolitionist movement has become so strong. But most of the rest of the country wants somebody other than Lincoln. Now, it helps Lincoln electorally because of the House of Representatives being based on population, that most of that population is going to be in those northern areas. But by and large, once the Republican Party has power, and we've talked about before, and the Democrats leave of the South, they're able to get their agendas passed. In this time period, more or less, they're going to have a handful of things that are very pro-business oriented, and they're going to get them all passed in the time period. And that's going to be helpful for the Republican Party. Most important than anything else is the high tariff, and then the Homestead Act, which is something, again, those free soil people ever since the 1848 time period have wanted. The idea that it's too expensive to own land, so why don't we just give 160 acres away for free to anybody who can get out there for 5 years. And eventually they also had the contract labor law, and then the also First Conscription Act, which we talked about in the social issues before. Now, Lincoln is not super popular throughout most of his presidency. He's probably close to being the most hated president we've ever had while being president. We will end up loving him and worshiping him and honoring him and making great marble things and naming pennies after him and all kinds of other things. And about every fifth high school in America somehow or another, and about half the roads in America. But in his time period, he was not very well liked until the last few months of the war. But in 1864, he was so worried that he may not actually get the nomination from his own party. He was being challenged by John C. Fremont and a handful of other people who wanted more push on the abolitionist movements, that he really decided to kind of play it safe. So in 1864, as he gets ready to run against George McClellan, his old general, he decides to kind of do something to unite the party. So he puts the one Southern senator of the 22, since there were 11 Confederate states that had broken, the one Southern senator who had constantly supported the Union, that was Andrew Johnson. So he is a Southern Democrat from a seceded state who's a slave state, and he himself was a slave owner. But he puts him on the ticket so he can kind of present himself in 1864 as not just the Republican Party, but the brand new 1864 Union Party. The Union Party, in other words, the Party of America, the party that wants to keep everyone together, is going to be the new party. and that is the party that runs in 1864. There really is no Republican Party per se, at least officially, even though it was like 90% Republican and then some more Democrats. But in 1864, as the election between McClellan and Abraham Lincoln is playing out, you have, in essence, the worry that the North Republicans will still be seen as a sectional party, not the party of the country. As this political cartoon kind of shows, George McClellan being the one person who's going to basically kind of like hold the country together against all odds, one way or another, the Union must be saved. Now, in the midst of this, then, what you have is an idea that Lincoln may very well lose this thing. So as he's worried about it, as he goes through this process, getting ready to lose the presidency, but he ends up not. McClellan ends up kind of having your cake and eating it too problem, as this political cartoon shows. He basically is for ending the war, but continuing the war all at the exact same time. And as you can see the little Lincoln in the background jokingly saying, I tried to ride them 2 horses in the pencil for 2 years, Mac, but it didn't work. You can't have them both. So McClellan ultimately in 1864 will end up losing. The Democrats will lose. It doesn't hurt that the southern states are not allowed to vote, obviously, because they're not even here at the time period. And most of the Union soldiers are going to vote out in the field. There's a whole bunch of different corruption, different allegations of corruption, ballot box stuffing, things like that. But Lincoln easily wins if you take a look at that in the actual electoral college in that particular 1864. So 1864, but if you look at the popular vote, it's pretty close. 55% to 45%. I mean, that's a little bit of a kind of a problem here if you think about it. When it comes to the electoral vote, that's one thing, but the popular vote, I mean, now if you're a Democrat, you know you lost, but you're looking forward to the day when all these southern states come back in the Union and they are not fans of the Republican Party. In essence, they are the opposite of fans of the Republican Party. What they want is to have the Democrats take back the United States. So if you're a Republican, keep this in the back of your head. Your worry is that having control of the entire system, President, House, Senate, you will soon find yourself out of luck once the Democratic Party reunites Southern and Northern. That is your big fear. It's the opposite of the political suicide of 1860. So as we go through this process of 1864, it obviously plays out differently. Lincoln is shot. Oh my gosh, sorry. If you hadn't heard that yet, if you didn't read to the end of the chapter, spoiler alert, I didn't mean this. Okay, he lived happily ever after in the warm embrace of Mary Todd. Anyway, so he's assassinated, John Wilkes Booth, 1865, just literally 5 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse to Ulysses S. Grant. And so the entire story of the war takes on a different place. Now, when he was assassinated, and they found the conspiracy of different people trying to kill everybody in this process. When this first happened, there was an interesting relationship with Andrew Johnson and the Radical Republicans. Remember, the Radical Republicans really were not fans of Abraham Lincoln, pretty much at all. They felt he was too wishy-washy. He was too wishy-washy. He was not strong enough against abolition. He was definitely not pushing for making blacks into voters and citizens. And so Andrew Johnson had actually talked a lot of basically tough talk against the Southern elite that had started this war. He basically blamed it all on them. And so he was a little drunk on the day of the actual inauguration on March 4th, 1865. He had a cold. It was a really bad cold. Supposedly, as the story goes, he had never drank before in his life. So he got like one little shot of whiskey from one guy and another shot of bourbon from another guy. They all had a little hip flask and stuff like that. And so he gives his speech in the Senate. And as the story goes, Lincoln was sitting there with his head down, just twisting his hat in his hands, as Johnson basically channels Andrew Jackson here, the man of the people. I'm going for to tell you here today, I'm going for to tell you I'm a plebeian, man of the people, in other words, of the Roman days. I glory in the people. Yes, the people have made me what I am, and I'm going to afford to tell you here today, yes, in this place that the people are everything. So that's like common man democracy, Jacksonian democracy. That is the everyday guy. And Johnson was an everyday guy. Now, he had done well, been a tailor, so I always looked the part, and he had made a lot of money for himself proportional to where he started, and he was a heck of a stump speaker, but he was not much of a drunk stump speaker. And so supposedly when he did this, people were a little bit embarrassed. Now, again, he's going to get you'll see in political cartoons him holding a bottle, which is kind of the idea that he was a drunkard, even though he'd probably never drank before this particular day from everything I've read. But first impressions are often lasting impressions, so America had this feeling. But the radical Republicans had remembered him talking tough as a senator, and they remembered him talking tough as the military governor of Tennessee, that if he was to have his way, the South would basically be punished. And he didn't really mean the South. But remember, as we were talking in class before this whole coronavirus broke out, the Southern slaveocracy was the billionaire class of the time period, and he was against them. And so the radical Republicans were pretty excited that maybe, just maybe, if he was president, he would be tougher on them than Lincoln was. So when Lincoln is assassinated after the election of 1864, that's not coronavirus. That's just, I've got to stop smoking 17 cigars every morning before I actually start to do these things. So the election year is 1864. Actually, it's on your side over here, 1864. And then in 1865, Lincoln's elected. He then is assassinated in April. And then Congress used to stay away. Congress would be away. Congress didn't stay there like they do nowadays. Congress would go back home, and Congress was going to basically be gone for the entire next 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months. And while they're gone, Democratic seceded Southern State Senator Andrew Johnson brings back all 11 Confederate states back. So much so that by the time that they come back, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, was sitting there representing his state of Georgia, which just really pisses off the Republicans. The radical Republicans won't even let him be seated. And so they stay in office for the next thing. Now, after the 1866 election, the Republicans win their 2/3 majority, basically, in some way or another, and they will override all of his stuff. And if you think about it, with a couple of exceptions, they really pretty much don't go home because they don't trust Democratic Southerner to be in charge of things when they're not there. So the radical Republicans will start to really control the game once we get into this time period, and they'll actually impeach the president. So there's all kinds of anger, there's all kinds of frustration when stories about the prison camps of the South, which are no worse than the prison camps of the North, but Andersonville gets out. A lot of Americans are angry. They want the South punished. The South doesn't seem to be repentant. But remember, if you are a Republican, the thing that horrifies you over here is what will happen when all of a sudden, in the midst of all this thing, the Democratic Party finally reunites North and South. Supporting detail-wise, I gotta get myself in the middle. Supporting detail-wise, remember, Lincoln did not get one vote, not one. In case you're challenged with the number one vote in 10 of the future Confederate states of the South, because there was no Republican Party in the South. It wasn't that they hated him that much, there just wasn't a Republican Party. So that was before anybody died. That's 1860, when it's just still anger and bluff and kind of like bluster and all that kind of stuff. But now with 620,000 people dead, Republican Party is probably not going to get any votes down there at all. And so that is what is scaring the crap out of you. So as the Republicans come back, not only are the Republicans now at the end of the war in 1864 at the election, but they then begin to think about some other things. Once that 13th Amendment has been passed and slavery is no longer allowed, the Southern blacks, 4.5 million, will now be counted as 5/5 of a person. So for census purposes in the 1870 census, what's going to happen is, well, it's actually going to happen right away, is that those Northerners are going to find that the Southerners not only actually get their votes back, but the Southerners are going to come back and they're going to actually have even more people. They're going to have 14 more congressmen. Because now blacks being counted, these freedmen being counted as a whole person, the South's going to come back, ironically, with more power than they had left with. And they're going to have to find some seats for them. And they will definitely come back as Democrats. And so what you have if you're a Northerner as a Republican is like, holy crap, we're going to lose this whole thing. And that's a really strong statement. Holy crap, I don't know where that came from. I mean, some like pile of, anyways, how is it holy? But one way or another, the Democrats are going to actually be now in the driver's seat. What is even worse for Northern urban Republicans is that Free Soil Party that we talked about, which had kind of been the main thing that they built their party on in 1854. Those guys in the blue, those 26 others, most of those are going to align themselves with the Democratic Party in the long run. They're not urban elites. They're not rich guys. And once the issue of slavery is over, so if you're a Northern Republican, the thought of the war ending is horrifying. Because what it means is that guys like Alexander Stephens channeling this stuff will, in essence, be in power when everything's said and done. So the radical Republicans, again, channeling John C. Calhoun's anger, in essence, will say, basically, the South, you need to get out. And so this is going to be the process that is going to be in time to play with. Think about the Republican Party, in essence, is going to, for the sake of politics, is going to kick out all of those Southern Democrats until such a time as they can build their Southern base off of these newly freed 4.5 million blacks. Now, obviously, when we say 4.5 million, that doesn't mean that everybody's a black man. They're not all going to have the right to vote. Many of them are women and children and such, but just proportionally. If there are about 5 million whites in the South after the death of the Southern War and about 4.5 million blacks, if the Republican Party can basically be the dominant party in the North and then can build a Southern black voting base that is almost tied to the whites, and think of the 14th Amendment, if they can find a way to kick out former Confederates that served in the Army willingly, not drafted, or had been Confederate politicians, if you can find a way to kick those out, you could be a Republican Party that is going to be dominant for decades to come. And so this becomes part of the story of finding a way to let blacks back into the Union as citizens, voting citizens. And that is why we're going to end up getting our 14th Amendment passed through. And the 15th Amendment, also at the time period, is going to be, let me see if I can get myself on this side. 15th Amendment is going to also be then part of this game. How can we find a way to get blacks to be able to vote? So the 15th Amendment is not necessarily a needed amendment. It is part of the 14th Amendment. The 14th says that you have the right to vote because you have the same rights, and then the 15th Amendment is going to be basically a highlighted thing. So as this political cartoon shows, you have an ex-Confederate States of America guy, always in his white linen, frustrated with his hands in his pocket, and he's basically pissed off at the devastated South. And then you have this newly freed military Union soldier wearing his thing, male, 21, any whatever race, and he has the right to vote. In other words, former Confederate white Democrats won't be able to vote, and black Southern Republicans that are now returning to the South as citizens will be able to vote. Now, so for the Republican Party, here's one of the ironies of this particular whole thing. And it is an irony. You don't want blacks to come north because they have to stay in the South to win those states. Most of the Electoral College, not all of it, but most of the Electoral College is based on a kind of a winner-take-all process. So if I win by one vote in New Jersey, I get all of New Jersey electoral votes. So it won't do any good to let 4.5 million freed blacks come north. You're already going to win many of the northern states. To win presidential elections, they have to stay as a counterbalance to whites in the South. This is complicated and not very happy-like stuff. It doesn't make the Republican Party look very good in this time period. So if you're going to be a majority of some of these southern states, and if you can take some of these whites out, you'll be able to win some of these southern states in the future. And that is part of the politics of Reconstruction. When it comes to this time period, then, we have, in essence, an idea. Now, the 13th Amendment, if you remember, got to move me over here, sorry about that. The 13th Amendment, if you remember, for the most part, at the beginning, was not ever going to be able to be passed when it comes to the free states, of which there were 18 at first, and slave states. There's just no way in the days of Lincoln. Now, again, as this thing moves, what happens after the free states are going to bring in Kansas. It comes in as a free state. And then ultimately West Virginia is going to come in. You're going to have like 20, but slave states are only 4 of them. They're going to be basically Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia is a slave state, and then Maryland. And so as these slave states are in essence there, what you have then is a total is 23 states. And all you needed to get is, remember, an amendment to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. Slavery no longer is allowed in America. That will kill the Dred Scott decision because the Dred Scott decision was based on the Constitution. So if the Constitution says slavery is illegal, you've got to get a 2/3 majority of both houses. That's up over in the corner over there. And then you're going to need to get a 3/4 of the states. So ironically, again, if you take a look over this spot, over there, there, the South never would have been able to have slavery be destroyed because there's no way. But now that they've left, the whole thing is up for grabs. So to get a 3/4 total, you basically have 18 states, and they have one more they need. So ultimately, what you end up having then in this time period is the 13th Amendment passes. Now, the 13th Amendment passing then is going to outlaw slavery in those southern loyal border states, which means 1, 2, 3, 4 of these slave states below the Mason-Dixon line and the 3630 line, in essence, are going to end up joining the 11 Confederate states. So there's going to be 15 slave states that are going to kind of constitute what is often going to be known as the Solid South afterwards, because those border states are going to be a little frustrated that the Emancipation Proclamation that had said that they can keep their slaves all of a sudden doesn't work anymore, because the 13th Amendment says you now have lost your slaves. So in essence, you have 15 pissed off former slave states that are going to often work in unison. They are going to be known as the Solid South, at least the bottom 11, or the Cotton Belt. You'll see this in a second. Again, as we looked at the economic stuff, you're going to have carpetbaggers, Northerners coming down, and they're going to try to take advantage of a very cheap investment process in the South. That's going to anger a lot of things. So the politics of the South for white people are going to be basically this idea of never voting for Republicans, and it's this idea of what is known as redemption. We've talked about this a couple times. Redemption is going to be basically turning back the clock so white-only rule in the South is optional, and keeping blacks out of the South as best you can. And it's this kind of phrase, the South is going to rise again, right? The idea the South is going to rise again, in essence, is this kind of reference to the idea that we're going to have Southerners take control of their reality one more time, once again. And one of those Southerners is Andrew Johnson again. Now, as we've seen, he's going to be fighting Thaddeus Stevens. We talk about these railroad trains, and they're going to be talking about 36, not 25. That means the 11 Southern states can't vote. And over here, we're going to basically help you out by chopping off your legs, and we'll put on these constitutional amendments. So what you have in the South then is this wrestling match between blacks, we're representing the Republican Party, and Southern whites. And in the midst of this 13th Amendment, then the 14th Amendment is going to come along and give equality. And then eventually, as we've said, they're going to try to move for the idea of having an election. So in 1866, we talked about this a couple times. You have to remember 66. In 1866, you're going to have 2/3 of majority. So 66% is 2/3, and that's all it's going to take to override a presidential veto, as you learned in 8th grade, and it was tattooed on your arm or your leg or the back of the neck of the person in front of you you're taking a test from, so you can see the 2/3 majority on there. So one way or another, in 1866, the Republicans, the radicals, led by Thaddeus Stevens, are going to have all kinds of power, including to actually impeach the president. And they will come very close to actually finding him guilty. Bill Clinton won't be there. Nixon will leave before. Trump just kind of was able to dodge it just a little while ago, as we've seen. So we've basically had 3 presidents. Now, remember, another element to think about, just one little tiny edge of this thing, is that during the Civil War, Lincoln had become our second imperial president. He had become the guy that had way too much power, and a lot of Congress just is angry at presidents in general. So between the idea of what he did, Andrew Jackson, his imperial presidency, you now have the idea that not only has Andrew Johnson been a Southern seceded slave state Democrat, but he's thwarting the rule of Congress. Congress, as our founding fathers had set it up, is supposed to be in charge. That's the way it was supposed to be from the beginning. So what you have then, in essence, is this kind of thing coming down to the last. And in the Senate, they then heard the proceedings carried out by the House, just like it had done just in the last one with President Trump a little while ago. And it came down to that guy, Republican Senator of Kansas, Edmund Ross. And when he really looked at it, he decided, even though he was a Republican, that the president really hadn't done anything worth being kicked out of office for. There are disagreements, but the idea that it was a dangerous kind of precedent to set where a supermajority of one of the two parties could basically just kick out a president when they didn't like it. And you heard echoes of this in this last election as we had this time around in this last impeachment hearings of President Trump. The idea that one party could become so powerful they could do this is a dangerous thing. So by one vote, he decided to not convict the president. So remember, Andrew Johnson was impeached, Clinton was impeached, Trump was impeached, but when it went from the House to the Senate, they were not found guilty of the high crimes and misdemeanors. If they had been found guilty, they would have been kicked out of office. So we've had 3 presidents impeached, 3, Holy Trinity of 3 presidents impeached. I don't know if you're going to call it a Holy Trinity, but 3 presidents impeached, not one of them been found guilty. So eventually in 1868, then, Andrew Johnson, for all intents and purposes, is just dead in the water all the way to March 4th, 1869, when Ulysses S. Grant will take over. And in the 1868 election, it's going to be Ulysses S. Grant against Horatio Seymour, a one-time governor of New York, and a guy who also had that cool chest hair, kind of that John C. Calhoun. Again, if you're living in colder climates, you want to have that kind of natural scarf that John C. Calhoun had. So in the 1868 election, Grant is going to win, and he is going to start to basically rule, and he's going to do it fairly well. All things concerned, he does a pretty good job. He tries to actually kind of fight the KKK, which he does fairly well again. And what he knows is going to be happening is that when you'll see Democrats are going to constantly try to get anybody from New York, because if you take a look at it, New York is our biggest populated state. California only had 5 electoral votes. Now it has 55, but back then it only had 5. New York was the big guy. So if you can get a guy like Horatio Seymour to be your actual candidate, and he's governor, the idea is that you'll win, which they did. And so again, if you're a Republican, the horror of horrors, what's going to happen when these southern states all of a sudden come back fully online, and the whites more or less are going to vote for Democrats because they hate the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, and the blacks will be scared out of voting by the KKK and Knights of the White Camellia and things like that. So if you're a Republican, you see a ticking time bomb here. It's going to just only be a matter of time before all of a sudden you're kind of kicked out of office. This process. Oh, there's my dog again. So everyone say hello to Chloe. Chloe. Hello, Chloe. Wait, where's Chloe? Chloe is a 10-year-old girl today. 10 years old. Hi, Chloe. All right, so on to the actual rest of this thing. So when the Solid South comes back solidly Democratic, the Republican Party is probably going to be just dead in the water, and they know it. So in essence, what's going to happen is this fear of the 1867 time period, radical Reconstruction along 1869 is going to go on, and they push through the 15th Amendment, the right of voting. Now here is where then this gets kind of sad. Ulysses S. Grant will do a great job of trying to destroy the KKK and the Knights of the White Camellia. But he really never does it for the sake of the 14th Amendment, blacks being able to be equal citizens. Where the federal government will be used over and over and over again will be in cases of supporting the 15th Amendment. In other words, rights of blacks to vote, but not necessarily keeping them from being terrorized by the KKK on any other different election day. So on election days, 15th Amendment, for the sake of politics, the blacks will get much of the northern support. But on everyday life, they don't get almost any support. That idea of equality won't even come about till well into the Civil Rights Movement. So the Jim Crow Black Code laws, you got to have those memorized. Those will be just pounded in no matter how they end up doing the test this year or the years to come. Those Jim Crow Black Code laws are designed to keep blacks as second-class citizens, and that's just part of the way it works. Now, the hope of Grant and many of the Republicans is that they'll be able to, at least while in power, transform the actual state laws and override local Jim Crow laws and things like that. But by and large, there's not much they can do. But in the radical rule of this time period, when blacks are allowed to vote and are allowed to run for office and are allowed to take over some of these, or at least be partners in the taking over of these newly reconstructed southern states, one of the few things that they actually get pushed through is pretty cool. You actually are living it. Well, maybe not right now because of the coronavirus. But it is the idea of public education. This is one of the legacies of the radical rule. They really start the idea of statewide public education. Prior to that, it had been kind of a church type thing or sometimes a city type thing. Massachusetts had a little bit of it. But by and large, the idea of black rule and the legacies is going to be public education. The right of getting our kids the right to an education, regardless how much money they do or don't have. Now, remember, the southern states were put back into kind of a territorial status with former Union presidents generals leading them. And that'll, in essence, little by little, when they finally adopt the 15th Amendment, you can see the dates on there, and I'll post this later on for you. Don't have to have them memorized, but you can see for the most part that's what happens. Now, blacks are allowed to vote. And again, if you see this white kind of clear bottle that has a little wooden stand, those are to keep those little glass jars from rolling all over the place. That is a ballot box. That is a ballot box. So those are ballot boxes. They're not really boxes, but those are boxes. And those boxes, anytime you see them in a political cartoon, that has the right to vote. That is symbolic of the right to vote. So what you have then in this time period is the idea that blacks are being used as pawns, as these two political cartoons will show you. And they're pretty much accurate. You have the idea that here, blacks are going to be scared into not voting or scared into voting for, again, a white Southern Confederate States of America. Or over here, blacks are going to be forced, and here's a man looking on kind of disgruntledly going, oh my gosh, I can't believe what it's come to. And he's in his white linen. So here's a good old Southerner. And here is then at bayonet point, the black is being forced, here's his ballot box, to vote for the Republicans. So when it comes to actually bias analysis, this is obviously a Democratic cartoon. This is a Republican cartoon, but they're both hitting the same thing just from different angles. Blacks are being used as pawns. And so anytime you see this idea of a peace offering, this idea of a ballot box, that's a ballot box, ballot box, ballot box, ballot box, blah, 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 blah. Try to say it 27 times fast. You can't be done. So Jim Crow black code laws are going to have to be memorized. These are the things that are keeping blacks from being full citizens. That is the right of them as 14th Amendment full citizens. The Supreme Court, the actual Army, Ulysses S. Grant, they're not supporting the right of blacks to have citizenship. They are supporting the right to vote for politics. And again, the idea that we really don't want blacks to leave the South because we need cotton to be kicked again. We need it to kickstart our economy again. We need it to be sold. So what you have for the sake of politics then is blacks are in essence stuck in the South by a kind of conspiracy of sorts, not the kind of conspiracy where people are sitting behind like these doors going like, we have an excellent plan on how to keep. It's not that kind of a thing. But the idea is that we need certain things to happen in the economy. And we don't need blacks to be voting and working in the North. We need them to stay in the South as sharecroppers. So eventually our religious/racial issues that we still have these days are an outgrowth of this time period. And in 1872, Ulysses S. Grant wins again, as you can see in the Electoral College. He runs this time against Horace Greeley, editor of a New York magazine. And he basically will die very quickly after the election. So even if he would have won, he wouldn't have been president for very long. But eventually what ends up happening, this 72 election, is that by 72, we're now pretty much 7 years into Reconstruction. And many Northerners are beginning to get tired of how much money it's costing constantly. And so what you end up having is the Republican Party, which has become the party of more or less big business ever since the Civil War, starts becoming really corrupt. Now, not all Republicans, obviously, and Grant himself, really, anytime I've read, I've not found any historian that's ever said that he himself was personally corrupt, as this cartoon kind of shows. But a ring, in essence, is going to be a symbol, the Navy ring, the whiskey ring, the military ring. These are going to be symbols of conspiracy, corruption. So like you never can figure out where the thing starts, who's actually at fault. And so here you have Grant with his attempt to get a third term, holding through this little band of corruption, all these different guys that were either working for him or part of his administration. So Grant is going to have the most corrupt administration, presidential administration in American history, all the way up till 1921, when Warren G. Money Pimp Daddy Harding will become president later on. And we'll talk about that in a future lesson. So by 1872-73, it became pretty obvious to many Americans that the Republican Party had lost its kind of way, had become a little too enamored with money of the big new industrial revolution, which we'll be talking about in our next lecture. And the corruption is going to hit a breaking point on what is known as Black Friday 1873, and that's when the stock market just collapses. The United States goes into the deepest depression it's ever had at that time period. And what happens then is many Americans begin to really feel, if I don't have enough money for myself, why are my tax dollars going down to support blacks and their right to vote in the South? So by 1876, after 2.5 years of the longest, deepest depression we'd had up to this time period, many Northerners are done with Reconstruction. And so in the 1876 election, again, you have Democratic governor Samuel Tilden. We'll talk about him in a little while again with Tammany Hall. He will, in essence, win the election because he gets the vote of many of the northern states. He gets the votes of all southern states, except 3 of those southern states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, are still technically connected and controlled by the government of radical rule. And so, in essence, they recount, and we end up having a 185 win by Rutherford B. Hayes. But all hell breaks loose when that actually gets into the United States government. So the idea that you have in this political cartoon here, it's hard to see, but in this corrupt bargain of 1876, is you end up having, let me make myself very small. I'll make myself very small if I can. Yeah. So in 1876, basically, you have a white northern hand New York, holding a gun, manufactured, and a white Southern hand holding a whip. So in other words, the New York Democrats are now reunited with the Southern seceded, now back in the Union Democrats. And they, in essence, are saying, we're going to have Civil War Part 2, Tilden or blood. So unless you let Tilden win, which everyone knows he won, but they recounted those 3 states, what's going to end up happening is we're going to have another war. So in the midst of this, they then have a kind of wrestling match of sorts. Now, in this particular election, you ended up having Ruther Fraud B. Hayes. That's his nickname. That's not what his real name was. That would be too ironic if his actual name was Ruther Fraud B. Hayes. And then he ends up being fraudulently elected president. But that would have been cool. What a premonition on his mom's part way back when. And this is Peter Cooper, who is basically running for the kind of like the temperance / greenbacks party. A bunch of people are still frustrated. And then Sam Tilden, the Democrat. So in this particular election, the Supreme Court had 5 people to choose. The House had 5 people, and the Senate had 5 people, and there was going to be a tie. And then David Davis, who was Abraham Lincoln's old best buddy, he was a Supreme Court justice. Everyone knew he was honest, though, and so he was going to rule probably. So it was going to be like an 8 Democrat, 8 Republican. 7-7 split, and then he'd be the tiebreaker. And then at the last minute, Illinois, where he was from and Lincoln was from, made him their senator. And so he basically quit being Supreme Court justice, went back to being a senator. And the Supreme Court picked one more guy who was easy Republican. So Ruther Fraud B. Hayes ends up winning not only by 1 electoral vote, but by 1 vote of this general commission. And the idea was all hell was breaking loose again. And so at the very last moment, in 1877 then, as this is being right before we end up having another Civil War, the Republican Party, not Ruther Fraud B. Hayes himself, but it was obviously done with his backing, more or less says, hey, South, not so fast. Why don't we end Reconstruction? You let our guy be president, and we'll let bygones be bygones. So as part of this political cartoon shows you here, this black man is trying to vote for a Republican vote, but he's being held out of the polls by all these former Confederate states and the KKK guys. In other words, as of 1877, all the way as this cartoon shows in 1892, blacks in essence have been told you're no longer allowed to vote. So bit by bit by bit, what ends up happening is you end up having this kind of interesting process in politics. You have what is known as yellow dog Democrats. And the idea, a yellow dog, in essence, was a Southerner who was so pissed off the Republican Party that they wouldn't vote for a Republican candidate for president, even if that Republican candidate was Jesus himself. I'd rather vote for my yellow dog. So those are yellow dog Democrats. And what will happen is the South will start to become what is known as the solid South. They'll vote, in essence, Democratic all the time. Well, the Republican Party in the aftermath of this time period, as you're going to see where we're going next, is going to start waving what is known as the bloody shirt. In other words, every time they're on the verge of actually losing an election, they're going to remind people that if you scratched a rebel, you'll find a Democrat. In other words, there was no Republicans in the seceded Southern South. And so they're going to kind of form themselves based on these new kind of a lobbying firm. They're going to call themselves the Grand Army of the Republic. And these are veterans from the actual Civil War, Northern veterans. And they will be the backbone of what is called the Grand Old Party, the GOP, which is the Republicans, even though they're not as old as the Democrats. The Democrats were around since 1825, the Republicans since 1854. So anyways, one way or another, though, the GAR, in essence, will be voting for the Republican Party. And the Republican Party controlling Congress will repay their support and patronage by passing all kinds of pensions for those vets to be able to actually get, lifelong retirements. And days before Social Security, they're going to get money from the federal government for thanks for being a vet. They begin to ease all the kind of rules on it, including getting to the point where one man actually was able to get a lifetime pension by proving that he was going to serve in the Union Army. He was on his way to volunteer, but on the way, I'm not joking, it's right there in the book if you remember in chapter 26, he actually ends up having a horse accident, breaks his leg, and so he's not able to support, but he was going to, so he ends up getting a pension. So they end up having government money being given away, in essence, for people to vote. That's the Republican Party. Now, before you get all angry for those of you who are Republicans saying like, sure, the Republican Party is, they're turning their back on blacks. They're basically kissing up to big business. They're kissing up to the Grand Army of the Republic. Remember, the Democratic Party was the party of the KKK in the South and those white liners. So it's not like there's a lot of happiness around for either of the two political parties we have nowadays, either way. So when it comes to this time period of politics, Reconstruction will then give way to a bunch of new things. The Republican Party would become the party of business and most of the inner cities, with the exception of New York. New York, as this picture over here has the ballot, that's going to be Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall, in essence, we're going to talk about later in the next lecture, but Tammany Hall is going to be basically building itself off of immigrant votes in the North. So the Democratic Party will start to vote, base itself on immigrant votes in northern cities, especially the Irish. And so what you end up having again in this time period is NENA, no Irish need apply, but they will vote early, vote often. So the Democratic Party is going to build its base off of immigrants and much of the Solid South. The Republican Party is going to make itself off of workers in the South and workers in the North. And so what you have then is this political cartoon here of a Republican Uncle Sam kind of like kissing up to big labor. In other words, the anti-immigrant labor. And this is going to be from a different time period in the 1870s and 80s. And eventually what ends up happening is you have this idea of money. Money is going to make the world go around in politics of the 1870s again. So that's where we're going. So by the time we get done with all this kind of stuff, we're going to end up having lots of changes in this time period. North, South, East, West, conservative, liberal, things are flipping back and forth. You have the Grand Army Republic, and stalwarts of Republicans who vote for Republicans no matter what, anytime. And then in the South, you end up having those white liners and the KKK, which are the worst. And they want to go back to the good old days when blacks didn't vote. Yellow dog Democrats in the midst of this kind of time period. And then, trying to get this through here, you're going to have some liberal Republicans like the Mugwumps and the Goo Goos. You're going to have some liberal Democrats like the Carpetbaggers that are coming down and trying to change things. So both parties will have a liberal edge and a conservative edge. Both parties will have a northern version and a southern version. And the Democrats and the Republicans are going to kind of break up, are going to be in this time period. So both parties are going to be this. All right. So again, where we are when we get to this time period politics-wise, as we talked about before, you end up having this very famous political cartoon, a white Southerner, Confederate States of America, holding the lost cause. He's joining hands. He's working along with big business of the North. That's Fifth Avenue. That's New York City, rich guys, along with the Irish workers of the Democratic Party. So the new modern Democratic Party is going to be the Solid South. Big business of the North that is sometimes not happy with the Republicans if they don't give them their tariff, and then the Irish workers. So one way or another, even if they're a Republican in essence, what they are doing is they're standing on then the newly freed men, keeping them from the right to ballot box vote, including being a soldier of the Union this time period. So eventually, one of the outgrowths of the Republican kind of dominance of this time period is that Democratic Party is going to be Solid South, and the Republicans are going to base themselves on blacks in the South, even if they don't vote very often or at all for another 100 years. But one of the legacies of the Republican Party is going to be that. All right. So struggle-wise, here's a way to kind of think about this. We've been having power struggles since we've talked about it. The very first power struggle is really that binary power struggle. Then we have like old lights versus new lights in the time period. And then we have, let me see, get myself over here in the small little corner. And then we have, after that, back. And then we're going to end up having in the 1770s, King George versus the colonies. Then we have small states versus large states. That's going to lead to the Constitutional Convention. Then we have the Constitutional Convention being ratified, the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, and the Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. And then slave states versus free states. That's what we've been looking at. And from here on out, and we're still there, in essence, from the 1870s till the current day, it's going to be the Democrats versus Republicans. They will spin around each other on different issues over time, as I'll explain in a second. But basically, that is going to be the story. But for the longest time, the Republican Party will base itself on blacks in the South, and blacks will vote Republican Party until it switches. And the Republican Party, the black vote, will then go from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, kind of starting in this New Deal time period. We'll talk about that later. But for the Solid South, it's interesting to think about, because if you take a look at these actual electoral college, whoops, let me sneak myself over here. I'll go over here. That'll be a good spot. Remember, blue Democrats, red Republicans in 1876. Those are the three states that would have voted, did vote, actually, Sam Tilden, until they got elected again. And then what you'll see in this time, just watch it, okay? Remember, 1880, Solid South. Blue, yellow dog Democrats, yellow dog Democrats, yellow dog Democrats, 1884, 1888, 1892, 1896, 1900. Blue Democrats, yellow dog Democrats, Solid South, 1904, 1908, 1912, 1916. Finally, in 1920, one of them break. Now look back. Once there in 1896, Kentucky. But by and large, those deep southern states, the ones that have been southern in the Confederacy, from 1876, other than 1876, because that's again, these guys would have voted all the way to 1920. In 1920, find Tennessee breaks. 1924 goes back. 1928, we'll talk about this later. One of the reasons why the Solid South finally breaks, if you take a look at it down over there, is because there was a Catholic running for the Democratic Party. Al Smith of New York ran, and that broke the Solid South for the first time in 1828. But it kind of goes back to being Solid South. It goes back to Solid South, 1936, 1940, 1944, 1948. Four of those states will walk because the Democratic candidate at the time period was the current president running for re-election, Harry Truman, and he had just signed the Civil Rights Act that basically desegregated the armed forces. And four southern states are going to bolt over the issue of race. They'll come back a little bit. Tennessee and Florida will vote different than 1852. And then 1856, again, the Solid South, by and large, are going to stay there. Louisiana will vote for Dwight David Eisenhower. And then, in essence, in 1960, a Southerner, Byrd, will actually win. But other than that, JFK will win those southern states. And then 1864, again, after the Civil Rights Act of 1864, the South will then vote Republican, which is interesting. The Yellow Dog Democrat South will vote Republican when a Southern president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, will push through the Civil Rights Act. So, for much of American politics, as a legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the politics of the South will be the politics of race. And when the Democratic Party finally allows blacks to have the right to vote, 100 years later, under the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the following year, what you start to see is the Solid South starts thinking that the Democratic Party of their tradition has betrayed them. So they'll begin to shift. Now, 1972, Nixon is going to win a huge win in 1972. Massachusetts ran, George McGovern, basically, I don't know if George McGovern even voted for himself that year. 1976, Jimmy Carter will actually be a Democrat from Georgia. So the Democratic Party will come back to a Southerner. The first Southerner to win, so that's really all the way back to basically Woodrow Wilson in 1916, 1912. And then 1980, Reagan will win. And he'll begin the process of reconstructing the South. And since 1980, you'll see by and large, more often than not, that Solid South that had been Yellow Dog Democrat will continue to be Yellow Dog Republican. So here is the conservative Solid South. More to do with race than necessarily politics and party alignment. So race is going to be one of the legacies, sadly, of the South. Anger, revenge, remembrance is going to be the voting politics of the South. Now, here it is over time. Ready? Just take a look at it. See, this is how sad my life is again. I spent like 25 minutes just putting this together by itself. That's how sad my life is. But if you notice that, Solid South, Solid South, Solid South. I don't know why the color changes in there, but it's basically Solid South, Solid South, Solid South, all the way to 1928 all of a sudden when it breaks again because we have a Catholic running for president. And then it goes back for a very long time until you get all the way up until 1964, 1948, when Truman basically desegregates the Southern, the Army, the armed forces. So, over the issue of race, what you end up having is most of this politics is going to be a game. So, ever since 1876, it's been pretty much a Republican-Democrat game. But the Republican and Democratic parties don't really need to believe in the things that they believe in per se, because from a purely Machiavellian perspective, they just have to win elections. That's their job. Remember, as hard as it is sometimes to think about it, individual politicians aren't this way. We hope and pray that they all have consciences and they do what's right for America and what's right for the country as a whole. But the political parties, they're not people. They don't have souls. They're like corporations. Their job is to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to win elections. And so if it means winning by doing whatever it takes to talk tough against immigration or possibly Muslims or blacks or Catholics or the environment, the political parties will do what they do. The legacy of 1876 and the corrupt bargain at the end that kills off Reconstruction and ends it dead in its right when the Republican Party turns its back on blacks as voters, and the KKK-dominated Democratic Party of the South, the party of politics is going to be about winning. One more vote than the other guys. All right. Till later.